I've done 17 companies and several unicorns. I was on the original management team at Click Software, which is sold to Salesforce for 1.35 billion, and also Eva.ai, an AI tech company that co-founded with Dr. David Yang. So today I have an incredible guest today. He's right here with me, and it's good to see you, Malik. So I'd like to welcome everybody to where we go beyond the pitch deck and into the minds of the builders, shaping the future. Today's episode is about something massive, how money moves. Not in Silicon Valley, but where the next billion users are coming online. My guest today is Malik. He's a co-founder and CEO of CashAfrica. He scaled a contactless payment system to over 30 million users, processing more than 10 billion in transactions. He's working with major banks and fintech players across Africa. But here's the real story. Malik isn't just about building a payments company. He's challenged the global financial order by creating alternatives to legacy systems like Visa and Mastercard, and rethinking how transactions happen in places where infrastructure was never designed for speed, access, or scale. This is about behavior change, financial inclusion, and leapfrogging entire generations of technology. So, Malik, it's good to have you here today.
Happy to be here, Gary. How you doing?
I'm doing great, man. I'm always doing great, though. So let me tell you, let's go down, dive into what did you see in emerging markets that others completely missed? And why is tap to pay and not just a convenience, but a necessity in these markets?
I think one of the things that we have seen in emerging markets is just the sheer size, right, of users, the sheer size of an economy that is still not running on the adequate infrastructures, right? Africa has crossed over a billion citizens, right? And, you still have, up to 80% dependency on cash, right? So that, that does draw some attention to what can be better over here, how should things be to be optimal? I think that was one of the first things that drew my attention, to be able to spur that interest to also, develop innovations back home.
Why is it, Malik, that Apple Pay or Google Pay, why don't they work in those markets, these emerging markets, like they should, or effectively?
Yeah. So the primary reason is that it's a very fragmented market, right? You've got multiple card schemes. I think, what the central bank had reported, up to 35% of payments, using cards get declined, right? As at 2020. So you can imagine the ability to not have, a stable infrastructure to be able to plug into some of this, centralized infrastructure like Apple Pay and Google Pay. And, that's just one of the reasons. Up to 90% of countries on the continent, Apple Pay is not supported, Google Pay is not supported. You have economies like India,
Why
Brazil.
support them though? Why isn't it? Because it's kind of a standard in a lot of places. Why don't they get support? Is there politics involved, or what is it?
So is the fragmentation, right? In America, as a popular example, you have Mastercard and Visa or American Express, being able to tighten up that infrastructure to be able to deliver Apple Pay, because Apple Pay is just a channel, right, for payment. Down in Africa, you've not been able to achieve, a more regularized or a standardized infrastructure for reliable card payments. So that then, left behind. So you have a lot of chargebacks. One of the most popular thing that in one of our primary market, which is Nigeria, is the card payments are still not as stable as you would want. Meaning that if Apple Pay exists today, Apple Pay would have to rely on an infrastructure that is not optimal yet. I think the second part of it is also,
If it's not optimal, what do you mean?
it means, if you slot your card into a payment machine, right? Even though your card is funded, even though there is internet service 5G, your payment can still decline, and
Wow.
you will still get debited, right? So that just shows the fragmentation of some of these local solutions in card payment, right? And that's one of the things that's given rise to one of the best payment infrastructures on the continent, which is the Nigerian interbank settlement scheme, right? That helps to transact instant payment. So you have people transferring instead of making card payments, people transfer from customer A to a merchant, and then wait for the merchant to receive that transfer instead of payments with cards. So just that fragmentation, right, has then reduced the appetite for industrial players like Apple Pay or Google Pay. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is the cross-border penetration as well, right? Like you would know, if you use Apple Pay in America, then you can fly down to Europe and also use Apple Pay. A lot of cards that are provided locally, even up till now, you find it difficult using them abroad, right? Meaning that there's no cross functionality of these cards. And Apple Pay is a global ecosystem that supports cross functionality. Google Pay is a global ecosystem that supports cross functionality. I think that's the second reason. The third, which is where we are directly tackling, is also the centralization of these infrastructures, right? Every single time before you can launch Apple Pay, you need to come down to the Bay Area and make a case with Apple's headquarters, right? So that sort of reduces your sovereignty as well. So you have countries like China just turning down the old solution, countries like India, building, UPI locally to say, I am China, I am India, right? Why should I have to, depend for my own country's payments to depend on a US or a Western company? So and at CashAfrica, what we've managed to do is to build some form of decentralization that will not require you to have access or require approval from Apple or Google to be able to launch contactless programs. Because as an independent company or a country or a nation, you should also be able to pick up the tools and then build out your contactless solution as it corresponds to your local market.
You processed 10 billion in payments. What were the hardest technical or operational bottlenecks?
I think the hardest for us is behavior change. Like you can imagine, whatever solution you are building, there is an existing, although crude alternative, right? So, you do need to, speak to a lot of users, find out, their biggest pain points. So that was it for us, right? So we needed a lot of partnerships to be able to accelerate user adoption, to be able to um, fast forward and deliver to more and more user pools. And I think behavior change is just one of the biggest obstacles, as ironic as it sounds.
So, how do you build trust in markets where financial systems are historically unreliable? Right.
um, I think the primary way to build trust, right, in markets like this, for us, what we found to work the most is to use existing channels, right? The best person to sell you a car was the person that sold you your horse, right? Meaning that, there's an existing market, there's an existing crude solution. If you can find a way to partner with these existing solutions to be able to offer this new and innovative solution, then of course the users that already trust the existing crude solutions would be interested in. So, one of the partnerships that we have with several banks like PalmPay or Sterling Bank or Alt Bank, these people have access to a pool of users that believe and trust in their brand. So when PalmPay, for example, announces that there is now tap to pay supported on their platform, their users are not seeing it as an external or a new or a strange form of payment because it's coming from the same trusted bank that they currently use. So that's one of the ways that you can bridge trust in some of the emerging markets. I think the second thing is to actually, because there's a small window between first adopters and trust, right? So first adopters would always pick up your product and they'll be interested in, oh, let me check this out. If you can allow that product to work, right, as promised, then you've built trust, right? So that's one of the things that I think virtually every demo, right, in our early days, we were very, very intentional about making sure that these payment channels do not fail. Because then if it fails, then, your promise and what you promised to deliver to the user as a solution is not there. And, then you've broken some form of trust.
What role do partnerships with banks like Zenith or fintechs like OPay play in scaling?
Yeah, you said where did they play in scale?
Yeah, what role do the partnerships with like Zenith or play in helping you grow your business?
Yes, so some of these partnerships, right? These banks have the largest pool of users, right? And it directly allows us to be able to um, um, deliver our product to a large pool of users, right? And that then means that working in partnership with some of these banks, we're able to then deliver this solution to a large pool of users, and that helps us with adoption, right? Because, for example, I think PalmPay has about 30 million users, right? We launched a pilot with with the company, and you find out that we are able to capture some form of that 30 million users, and then gradually market to more and more within that same user pool. So it's really one of the hacks that we have seen for scaling, to be able to secure a partnership and then offer tap to pay to an existing large pool of users for us. Yeah.
So, Malik, technology is easily compared to changing human behavior. How do you drive adoption at scale?
I think you know just making point to that earlier point, I think one of the ways that we drive adoption, right, is to just repeat what works, and that's be able to deliver that speed, right, the speed, the efficiency, and then of course that word of mouth as well, because at some point you do need to take your foot off the gas in terms of investing in a lot of PR and a lot of advertisements and activations, and then you have word of mouth pushing, to be able to say, oh, there's tap to pay now. Tap to pay is available at certain outlets, which then brings it to our next point, right? Um, um, the more places where people can tap to pay, and then you find out the more interest that users pick, right? So if you have more places where you can tap to pay, so we try and get as much partnerships with some of these large chains, right, that have 200, 300 outlets, to be able to offer tap to pay across the country. So it is beginning to seem like the norm, and availability is through the roof, and then that allows the user to begin to, if they're a first adopter, of course, try out the product. If they're not the first adopter, they would love to learn more, and if they keep seeing it, and I think it just goes and goes from there for us. Yeah.
So what incentives or design choices made users switch habits?
Yeah. So I think, first of all, is the local context. There's a local context for tap to pay. I think popularly in the West, you do not need authorization for some of the tap to pay payments that you make, right? So once you tap your card, the payment is successful. That does not work, right, in emerging markets, because these are fraud sensitive markets. So one of the design choices that we made is that every single tap to pay would require a split second authorization, right? So either you authorize with your biometric, with your meaning that your face ID or your thumbprint, this is what works, right? Because we've been able to add that local context into the product, right? Where every single African or Nigerian wants to authorize their payment. I remember we did a survey that showed that as little as 1 naira wants to be authorized by a Nigerian, right? They don't want to leave it to trust of the government or the payment ecosystem. They want to be in charge of it, right? And that's so strange, right? If you compare it to payment solutions in the West, because in the West you still have people signing checks, and just paying with checks, and just of course that trust ecosystem has been built. But down in Nigeria, you want authorization. So we made sure that in our infrastructure there is compulsory authorization unless this payment will not go through. And that was so well received, by users. Another hack that we do is, of course, via those partnerships as well, right? If your existing bank is telling you about a new product or a new feature that would make your life easier, we've seen that the potential of you adopting that feature is very, very high as compared to a new company marketing that product to you.
So if we look at this, are we understanding cultural dynamics in fintech adoption? Are there dynamics between the countries in Africa? Do you see their dynamics, or is it pretty much the same?
There are cultural dynamics. There are cultural dynamics.
Can you give me
Yeah, so popularly in Ghana, right, in the Ghanaian market, the biggest form of payment is mobile money, right? Mobile money simply means that your phone number is your account number. So every time you want to send money, all you need is your phone number, right? In Nigeria, mobile money exists, but it did not take off, right? Nigerians are more oriented towards app usage, visiting the bank. If you go down to Kenya, you have things like M-Pesa, right? M-Pesa takes a different approach where you have like these mini agents that are located all over the city or all over the country where users can easily stop by, complete transactions of withdrawals and deposits. So there is a lot of cultural dynamics, but one thing that we see that still remains constant across a lot of these cultural dynamics is ease, right? People want to move money with ease. They want to move money instantly and pay instantly, and just like be able to complete their payments in the shortest time possible, I would say.
so you talk about eliminating reliance on legacy networks. Does that mean decentralization, or what are you talking about?
Yeah, so that is decentralization. So, for example, today, a Nigerian is able to tap to pay thanks to Cash Africa without the existence of Apple Pay on the continent. A Nigerian is able to tap to pay without the existence of Google Pay on the continent, right? So that means that essentially we've been able to open up this infrastructure to say Google Pay is no longer needed, Apple Pay is no longer needed. You can still process tap to pay. A Nigerian is able to tap to pay without um, using Visa or Mastercard, right? That then means that also there's no longer over reliance on some of these central infrastructures, that might be not priced locally, might not respond to the local context, of the average African or the average Nigerian. So we have been able to build these rails that would decentralize and just open up, access, starting with Africa and then, hopefully scaling to more emerging markets as well.
How do you see the role of blockchain or digital currencies in your current ecosystem?
Um, I think it's as high as can be. Nigeria is, I think, in the top three countries that use the most cryptocurrency. So that just speaks to the adoption of solutions that just solve the problem, right? And I think the future that we currently live in. I mean, look at the geopolitical landscape right now. There would always be a reality where stable coins, cryptocurrency would always, is now the norm, right? And it would exist that way into the future because of the ease and also the decentralization it causes. At Cash Africa, one of the things that we do with cryptocurrency is on our roadmap, right? Because we cannot over innovate at the starting phase, right? So we are innovating on access to tap to pay, access to contactless payments. In an unfamiliar market, we did not want to complicate that with also leveraging that on top of crypto to the average user. But I think soon in our future, is stable coins and cryptocurrency will be one of the ways that we settle cross-border transactions and cross-continental transactions for that to pay as well.
So you talk about Africa, but what markets are next, and what determines the expansion?
I think after Africa is to look at South America, right? And then Asia as well. I think what determines those choices is the existing success and the existence of fintech unicorns across this climate, right? I mean, you have companies like Lemon Cash in South America that is doing so phenomenally well. You have UPI in India. These are infrastructures that can leverage decentralized contactless payments and allow them to also just quickly move money and move value between customer and merchants. So we are thinking South America, and then East Asia and West Asia.
No, there's a lot of opportunity. People don't get it. The population of isn't nearly as big as Africa, but it's about half the size, right? And it's growing. And there's a lot of opportunities there. Sometimes we forget about them. Go where other people aren't, right? There's less competition. You grow your market.
Yeah.
Uh, is this an Africa first model, or is a global infrastructure play? Are you doing it now? Are you going to start with Africa? I know you're doing Nigeria, but are you going to go through Africa first before you start down in South America, or what are you going to do? Is it a parallel strategy?
I think what we are doing is validating the model, right? Like I mentioned, through pre-seed, we are validating that model through pre-seed and seed, and then we open that infrastructure to the rest of the world, right? So anybody from any corner of the globe can pick up these tools and be able to essentially go live with their own tap to pay or contactless program, right? Locally without depending on a centralized infrastructure. So what we are thinking through is we are continuously validating that model in our local market, and then we open it up to a global audience.
So as you're going down through, is it's tough sometimes building a company. So what do you think separates Malik founders who scale in emerging markets versus those who fail? What do they know differently?
Um, that's such a good question because I wouldn't I wouldn't even say they know something differently. I think they just chose to stick through the pain. They just chose to exercise endurance and a lot of grit. For the long mile, because regulatory hurdles will come, customer hurdles will come. Fraud hurdles will come. Funding hurdles as well would come. If there's a funding slowdown, in the global market, I think what separates the founders that do have that impact is just the ability to stick around for the long while. I think that's just my own opinion. Being around for the long haul.
Yeah, no, you can't give up, right? Some people, because you can always pivot to success. What's one misconception about fintechs and emerging markets that people have?
Um, I think some of the biggest ones is internet penetration. Um, there's still this archaic opinion that maybe internet penetration has not ripened in places like Africa. I think in Nigeria, for example, up to 70% of the population is below the age of 30. There's 5G coverage in about 50% of the country. So internet penetration is moving at a rapid rate. So about 70% or 70% of Nigerians have access to a mobile phone, right? So that just shows you that the ability to access the internet, the ability to get online, as compared to 2005, 20 years ago, is no longer the case, right? So more people are online, more people have access, more people can, and of course, the banking penetration in markets like Nigeria, right, according to the central bank, has just crossed 70%. So it's about 72, 73%. So that shows you when you're thinking, can I offer credits in Africa? Can I offer payments in Africa? I mean, look at Africa has produced about 10 unicorns, right? So that shows you there's something going on there, that has been able to generate so much value, right? As compared to 20 years ago, where you might think, um, can I offer credit because I have people in Africa online? I think that's changed, and the future is just Africa now catching up to be able to optimize its systems, its forms of payment, and of course, tap to pay and contactless payments will be one of the game changers, of the ecosystem.
What's a misconception about fintech in emerging markets?
Um, One of the misconceptions about fintech specifically is identity, right? So there are so many alternative ways to verify identity now, as compared to a couple of years back. I think a lot of fintech companies have been able to, invest massively in identity verification, as compared to many years back. And the misconception that you cannot offer services because it's difficult to verify or check an identity or confirm an identity, I think is one of the things that has just gradually faded away, and it's no longer the reality on the continent and in our primary market, Nigeria.
What's one company you admire right now?
One company, I mean, is this in Africa or globally?
No, just globally, whatever. What's one company you admire right now? Big
I think as cliche as it sounds, I'm such a huge fan of OpenAI. Because even though, of course, there's a lot of innovation going on in the industry, they do feel and they are pioneers, right, in their own right, to be able to spur and push humanity into the accelerated artificial intelligence age. I think it takes a lot of boldness. I remember Sam talking about how they had that GPT-2, and all it could do was check plagiarism, and they were like, maybe OpenAI would eventually die, and it's not going to make it up to the next stage. And they've just been around for so long, and they have to exercise a lot of endurance, a lot of grit to be able to then all of a sudden everyone is interested in using some form of AI agent or an AI bot. And, that's just so admirable.
So we're coming to the top of the hour. Closing thoughts, and how do people get a hold of you?
I think I'm very reachable on LinkedIn. Of course, I'm also you can also send me an email at malik@cashafrica.co, or support@cashafrica.co. I think we want to continuously work with multiple partners that can help us to accelerate contactless in emerging markets, and of course, be able to just accelerate emerging markets into the new age of forms of payment.
When you go down through this, Malik, what you're building isn't just a company, it's infrastructure for a new financial world in order. From a behavior change to bypassing legal systems or legacy systems, this is what leapfrogging looks like. And you're doing a great job of it in real time. To all my audience out there, if you're thinking about the future of money, don't just look at Silicon Valley. Look at where constraints are highest. Places like Lagos, Nigeria, places like Kenya, because that's where innovation is fastest. So I want to thank you so much, Malik, for joining us today. It's for taking time out of your busy schedule, and thanks to all of you for joining one more time. GSD presents Silicon Valley AI and Tech, and my name is Gary Fowler, and I'm your host. Stay happy, stay safe, and stay healthy, and I'll be back to you again soon with another exciting edition. Malik, if you want to stay on for a minute afterwards, we can talk. Thanks, everybody.